Hello, everyone. This is Chad Frischmann, and I'm on a quest to find the most impactful solutions that not only help to solve climate change, but move humanity closer to a regenerative future. Climate change is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. This is not an alien attack or a monster from the deep seas. It is a crisis of our own making. Nearly everything we do as a species, everything our economy produces and consumes, emits greenhouse gases that are warming the planet and causing catastrophic climate change. And climate change impacts everything else, from increasing poverty and food scarcity to climate refugees, devastating biodiversity loss, and destruction to ecosystems and human systems that we are only beginning to glimpse of today. So, we have to change everything. And this is where it gets interesting. If we have to change everything, then it can be an opportunity to build a better future by design, a regenerative future that benefits humanity and the planet. Welcome to Chad's Climate Quest, where we will be talking to some planetary-grade thinkers and doers who are pouring their energy, wisdom, and intellect to solving this great challenge in ways that benefits all.
Now, before we get going into our discussion with guests, a bit of housekeeping. First, this is the 10th episode of Chad's Climate Quest and my first Twitter-spaced podcast. So please be patient with any technical glitches and smile at all the gaffes. And feel free to send along constructive feedback to help improve the show. Also, this is a 30-minute discussion. If you have any questions, please tweet them in the thread and join the Discord for further discussion. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on my Climate Quest. On today's episode, we're welcoming the one and only Kayalin Akens-Irby. Kayalin is an impact-oriented strategist who has spent her career working across tech, investment, and policy to reshape the way we do business and build a sustainable future together. She believes in order for us to meet our climate goals, we have to make climate the new culture. Hi, Kayalin. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming along my Climate Quest.
Thank you, Chad, for being such a leader and a light for many of us that are looking to bring deep, meaningful, move the needle solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm grateful to be here with you.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so kind. And honestly, I can't think of a better person to be on my show just before COP27 kicks off. Of course, I'm a little biased because I love you so much.
Fair enough.
You posted something really fun on Twitter a few months back. You said, and I quote, "In the climate space, we say that partnerships are one of the most important tools to scale climate action. For that reason, I'm excited to share that Shantae Harris, Chad Frischmann, and I are getting married. Wedding invites to come," unquote. Now, this was clearly tongue-in-cheek, though honestly, I couldn't think of two better humans to be married to. I mean, except for my current partner, in case you're listening, honey, I love you too. But but really, the sentiment that underlines this comment is, I think, really, actually really, really interesting. To scale climate action and to stop and reverse global warming, to create that regenerative future we're talking about here, we're going to need to have radically different ways of partnering and collaborating. And there involves a certain kind of commitment. So actually, underlying that statement is something had a very interesting idea. And I'm wondering, Kayalin, what do you think are the ingredients to a successful climate action relationship?
Oh, I mean, you're totally right. First of all, marriage still on forever. I don't take my commitment to you lightly whatsoever. So love you, honey. But I mean, I think that you're right. Yes, it's a joke, but not, right? When we think about kind of traditional partnerships or whatever it is in terms of the types of connections that previously existed in business, they're transactional, right? It's like, hey, you do something for me, I do something for you. Call it a day. If it's not mutually beneficial in ways that I think it needs to be, then I'm out. First of all, when we think about climate relationships, whether it be on the business side, whether it be between organizations, whatever it is, whether we are all the way there or not, we do need to start demonstrating what if not post-capitalist society, but a reimagined society can look like and can function as. Something I say all the time, one of our core values at Planet Forward, one of the core values in how we move through the world, whether that be with partners or competitors, is just this idea that there is enough climate change for all of us to tackle. So operating competitively is not actually conducive towards the end goal of what you're saying your mission is. I think that those ideas are kind of fundamentally at odds. And so in general, we need to collaborate. We need to work together. You need to move as fast as you can. I need to move as fast as I can. And ideally doing that together is the way to get there. And then additionally, like true long-term commitments. Like when we joke about marriage, I mean that in the sense that maybe today what I need or what you need are not exactly the same things, but we're in this together. And it's also an extremely emotionally draining, type of work to do where staying optimistic, staying fed, all of those things are difficult. So actually having kind of long-term commitments to the people in this work, I think is extremely important as well, because that's truly who supports you over time. And that matters.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, what marriage, what relationship, what any kind of relationship works in the long run when it's purely based on transactions. And when we're coming together on with such an important issue where we have to really change everything, we have to think in that long term and not only approach this, I think, I don't want to get your thoughts on this, but not only approach this from, this is a fight that we have to come together on, but also we can approach this with a certain amount of love and a certain amount, connection and joy, which is also built into that kind of relationship, that long-term committed relationship, that we joked about on Twitter. But the reality is it's like fighting the good fight together. It's just struggling together, which is, again, part of that relationship, but also loving and finding joy together.
And I think, the language we use is so impactful in how we conceptualize ourselves, conceptualize the world, and kind of going back to that idea of competition versus not. So much of the language that we use around business or any sort of endeavor is oftentimes things like fight and conquer and go kill it. All of these very war-based terms, honestly. And I think that shapes a lot of how we conceptualize, how we step out into the world every day. But an idea that has brought me a lot of joy lately is actually likening ourselves more to a forest or a garden in terms of just the mutualism and the way that nature creates symbiotic relationships. And as opposed to saying, go kill it, which is what I used to say every single morning to everyone, from my sister to my coworkers to anyone. Now I'm like, go bloom today.
Right.
And because, if we're both blooming, my bloom is not taking away from yours. In fact, now we are attracting more pollinators because we are both beautiful and have more to give. And that is like so warming to me.
I love that analogy. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's also that cross-fertilization that happens, right? That exchange. And it's kind of like we have to change the whole culture of how we're doing business, right? I mean, the culture of how we work together has to change. And, you're not only are you a voice, you're a voice for not just approaching climate action as a tech solution or behavior change, but you're talking about something really big. Talking about a new climate culture. And this is something that's both popular as well as business culture and how we integrate those together. And that coming together and that collaboration, that's a beautiful analogy. Actually, it was funny. I was talking to someone about you not earlier this week, and I said, she's the bomb. And I stopped myself and I was like, wait a second. Why am I calling her an instrument of death? She's not a bomb. She is, a maven, a muse, a poet, powerhouse, really bringing all of this sort of the tech solution, the culture, the poet. You bring it all together. And I love that about you. What do you mean, though, when you talk about climate culture? What does that actually look like, popular in business culture? And is it something that we should be embracing, or is it something we should be fearful of?
It's absolutely something we should be embracing and something that everybody plays a role in. So this is, deeply tactical, honestly. So I'll talk about it from both sides. And I think that, different parts of my career really kind of gather in this idea now that has become kind of one of my catchphrases, this climate is culture idea. So, starting with the way we do business, we've started to talk about this a little bit already today, but thinking about how we can reimagine. I started out my career doing ESG advisory in private equity, and I was one of the earliest employees from a firm called Malk Partners that went on the leading ESG advisor across private markets, and we built the ESG and impact investment strategies for most top funds across the US and Europe. And the idea there was that we needed to change the way that we business. Coming out of 2008, coming out of things that actually weren't necessarily climate related, we were given the invitation to take a broader lens to what we consider to be the drivers of value for a company. And reason being, investors basically started to get nervous that we didn't have enough visibility into the investments we were making. Thus, the 2008 financial crash occurred. And so coming out of that, we needed to pay more attention into how we were doing business. And so what we did there in terms of building out this trend of ESG investment was starting to take into account broader indicators of what it means to run a business well, starting to take into account things like anti-bribery and corruption, business ethics, environmental management, data privacy and security, looking into executive teams and paying attention to their workplace conduct and how they're treating their employees, all the way down to sexual harassment cases. And the Me Too movement was wrapped up in that as well. So really giving the basis for so many things that we today have seen as movements, bringing more transparency and also more accountability into the business world. So I'd say there's actually very tactical instruments that we're using to start to incorporate climate into the way we do business. And then that really goes into everything down to the decision drivers for an individual making a decision. If you only valued cost previously, let's value cost and carbon footprint when we're making transactions, when we're making purchases, when we're making new products, all of those things. So that's really where this idea of changing the way that business culture is done, by starting to include climate as a consideration alongside all of the other things that we're so familiar with including in our decision making. And then it becomes native to the way that we do business. And Planet Forward is helping with that process by providing full carbon transparency to businesses across their scope 1, 2, and 3 in a detailed way that allows for true decarbonization to happen. And then how does that translate into popular culture? Again, we do live in a society where what people want is what people create. And that's why Planet Forward explicitly focused on consumer companies when we were figuring out who our target market would be. If you think about what we think of as hard to decarbonize industries, we think about energy and transportation, manufacturing. But consumer companies, food and beverage, beauty, personal care, fashion, 90% of their emissions are within their supply chains, which touch every single one of those other industries. So actually a huge point of leverage when we think about decarbonization. And all of a sudden, we have this really awesome opportunity. Every year, rethink what their brand portfolios will look like in the future, what they're going to create, what they're going to make, how they're going to work, how they're going to operate. And now we have this great opportunity to make climate friendliness the new trend. We recently had a New York Times article come out called The Rise of the Climatarian, which you can imagine in terms of how people identify themselves. Vegan is probably one of the top Instagram bios today, right? Which is awesome. But imagine that starts to become climatarian, or people start to truly identify themselves as somebody who thinks about climate as a core driver of what they're looking for in the world. Then we're creating an ecosystem where businesses need to get on board in making the things that people want. And that's how we start to leverage popular culture, continue to drive this trend where we see, Adidas and Allbirds launching the lowest ever carbon footprint shoe. And we see Just Salad offering carbon labeled menus and all of these things that start to create an ecosystem where people identify as individuals that value climate. And therefore businesses have to transition to create climate friendly products and operate in a climate friendly manner. And that is the driver of value.
So it sounds to me like, climate, and I agree with you 100%. Climate needs to pervade everything in our culture, our language, as we talked about earlier. Let's get rid of these militaristic terms and other terms that are sort of built into that fossil fuel economy and start changing the language, music, movies. And you mentioned food. I mean, even food. Like the culture of food itself can be changed to be a climate action, and it doesn't need to be bad, right? It doesn't need to be a sacrifice. It can actually be pretty badass. Right?
Absolutely.
Brands have this huge role to play, right? How can we change the language and the perception of some of this stuff to make it actually, I love this, like climatarian. It's like, how do you make it cool to be, a climate solutionist, right? Or taking climate action. What are some of like badass climate, you mentioned the climatarian, which is pretty cool, but other sort of badass climate cultural things, artists, music, brands that you have encountered that you can point to and say like, look at what they're doing. They're making climate cool.
Absolutely. And that is it, right? Climate needs to be cool. cool is what we all want to be, right?
Right.
And therefore, we don't have to make everyone want to tackle climate change. We just need to make everyone do what they already do, which is want to be cool. So,
Right. Right. I mean, how many people want to tackle anything? I mean, talk about like right there, using the words tackling. We're tackling,
Mhm.
we're slashing emissions, we're cutting things down, but we could also be doing this with joy.
That is such a good point. I hadn't yet addressed tackling as part of that same, language barrier we were talking about earlier. Now I'm seeing
Yeah.
that too. So, okay, noted.
Well, maybe we'll get some American football players to come on board and tackle climate change with us.
They did do that for the Super Bowl commercial. They had the
Yeah,
tackling food waste commercial, and it had
that's true.
football players tackling people that were throwing away perfectly good food. So I love that. I mean, just some others to call out. I actually recently attended the Environmental Media Awards in Hollywood a couple weeks ago, which really was actually highlighting some of these exact wins. I mean, some to call out on the brand side, a company called Pangaea. They're backed by Pharrell. They are popping. They're doing great. They are the epitome of cool. And they're actually a material science company that is innovating on ways to replace fossil fuel derived materials within our fashion industry with things such as using upcycled food waste, turning that into fabrics, using carbon capture, turning that into inks, all of these different innovations where their materials and their processes are more sustainable, but they don't even talk about it that much. They just look cool.
Yeah.
And they have cool people wearing their clothes. And now all of a sudden everyone wants to buy it. And therefore they are by default participating in a climate solution. Or we have Billie Eilish, who working to power all of her shows with renewables and change the way that the entertainment industry is done. People aren't thinking, oh, I'm going to go to a Billie Eilish concert because I want to tackle climate change. They just like her music. They just think she's cool. Now all of a sudden they're participating in a climate solution. And so Don't Look Up, for example. People love Leonardo DiCaprio. They want to go to the movies. They want to go see something that's cool and that Jennifer Lawrence is in. They didn't know they were going to learn about climate, but that's what happened. And so the more and more we can somewhat sneak these climate solutions into what people are already doing, the easier the transition is, because we're not asking people to change their behavior. We're asking people to do what they were always going to do and to love it and to make sure that that is done in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, I love that. And it's almost like this Trojan horse kind of thing. We had this discussion a few of our podcasts, my podcast before, about the role of the consumer versus the producer. In fact, just last week with Hank Rogers, we were talking a lot about consumers and how consumers have the power to change, which I agree with. And, if we make the decision, the will to do so, we can make that change. But I also think it's kind of a privilege to be able to have that power to change and to make those kind of statements. Most people, I think, don't have the capacity to do that. They're living their day-to-day struggle. The struggle is real, right? And they have a certain amount of enjoyment that they get in life, and that's part of that popular culture. And at the end of the day, producers produce emissions, right? So how do we embed more of this way of sort of like, making sort of consumers play the role they're playing, but without actually, they don't need to go and protest down the streets. They don't need to, search for these products. We can actually be engaging with the celebrities and with athletes and with these brands to make things cool. That's what you're saying.
% I mean, first of all, I think that when it comes to this broader argument around the consumer responsibility, I agree. I do not believe that it is an individual consumer's responsibility to solve this crisis. I do believe that some of the same changes that we might act like consumer behavior change is the biggest goal of, is actually to drive competition amongst businesses. Businesses have the responsibility. Businesses are the ones that need to change the way that they're operating and what they're providing. And strict purchase dollars are not the only things that companies compete on. They compete on mind share. They compete on PR mentions. There's some companies that have entire teams dedicated not to creating products for the purposes of sales, but creating products for the purposes of driving web traffic and mentions. And so there is an element, back to this cool argument, of making this the thing that people want to talk about, the thing that people identify around, and then making it something that businesses compete on. Another huge kind of ecosystem lever that Planet Forward's working on pulling is the B2B side of things. Direct consumers are not actually the first buyer or purchaser that a brand has to work with when it comes to getting their products in front of people. It's actually the retailers and the distributors that are the ones purchasing their products first. And so we now have this beautiful potential to create a more conducive ecosystem where those companies need to reduce their footprint, but they don't have control over the direct processes that went into creating the products that they carry on their shelves or on their websites.
Mm-hmm.
So they are in a position where they want to incentivize brands to reduce because that inherently is their footprint as well. So consumers are not the only leverage points. There are so many, and we just need to pull as many as possible to make it a no-brainer for this to be the outcome.
Yeah, with those distributors, those retailers, I found over the years, working with Drawdown, people come to me all the time saying, where do we find these solutions? Where can I find regenerative agricultural products? Where can I find regeneratively produced materials? And, part of it is finding this, knowing where to go and the data surrounding it. And part of that is what Planet Forward's doing, right? I mean, it's a data-driven organization. How do you collect data to understand the LCAs of products being produced, right?
Absolutely. So we have one of the largest life cycle assessment databases for consumer products, materials, all the way down to agricultural production systems, including the only solution with the ability to factor in regenerative agricultural processes into our models. And so one thing that I'm really pushing for right now at the policy level, both the US federal level, something I'll be talking about a lot at COP27 this year in Egypt, is this idea of carbon labeling and transparency. Right now, we have a lot of competing claims and competing certifications on the sustainability side, everything from GMO to organic, which are all powerful and very important, but it's difficult for people to be able to determine what's better than something else. And also, if it comes down to actually tackling climate change, what's moving the needle on that. And the idea behind carbon labeling, which is essentially putting the carbon footprint of a product onto it in the same way that we have nutrition labeling today in food, for it to be a universal system that's comparable, where all of the individual decisions that you've made that ultimately end up in the life cycle of a product, everything from the farming practices that went into growing your materials, to the energy types that were used in your manufacturing, to the transportation types and routes that were existing in your supply chain, to the end of life of your packaging, whether or not it was recyclable or compostable, and whether or not it actually was recycled or composted. All of those are the individual sustainability decisions that we're all looking for brands to be making and that companies are grappling with in terms of which they should prioritize in taking part in. If we can have a system of strong life cycle assessments that can basically measure the impact of each and every one of those decisions, now we're in a position where even if you see tofus in a store, if one used regenerative agriculture in the growing of their inputs and had fully post-consumer recycled packaging and all of those things, before it would just say tofu is tofu and tofu is low footprint because it's lower than beef. Great. But now we get to a point where we can actually encourage continuous improvement, getting to a point where the status quo is not going to get us to the 90% reduction we need. We need to continue to encourage reduction forever till we get to a point where we're really reducing as far as we possibly can. So we want to set up a system where transparency incentivizes continued improvement across all levers of sustainability. And I see carbon labeling as a universal system that can help support that.
So with Planet Forward, this is a real deep tech solution, and I love it. I mean, there's Nico, there's nothing that gets me going more than good LCA data, right? I mean, gets me really excited every time.
Yeah.
Right, for real. And that's going to really help move the needle for those retailers and distributors who are looking for those products and looking to understand better how they can stock those shelves. I made that analogy last week. Consumers go to a grocery store being a metaphor of the whole system. And they go to that grocery store and 90% of what's on the shelves are part of the problem. We can't say to a consumer, you have to go and find those 10% as part of the solution. But the more that the retail distributors are actually stocking those products or, making those products available to consumers, that's where we're going to see more movement. And that comes with providing the good data and knowledge of where to find those products and validating that with real LCA data. So I really applaud what you're doing there. And, every time I speak with you and see you, your voice, your presence, just, it resounds with this optimism for the future and this certain kind of, how to put it, gentle confidence. Like you have a confidence, the way of being really that draws people to you because of that confidence and optimism. And I just want to know, where does that come from? Like, what are you optimistic about for the coming year and for the near future?
Yeah. First of all, I appreciate that. And I feel the same way about you, and it makes me warm to hear. I do consider myself to be an illogical optimist, and that's potentially one of my superpowers. Meaning, if you're somebody that pays attention to the odds and takes into account the probability that you will be successful in something before you decide to do it, there's a lot of things in the world that you will never try. And there's a lot of things that you would be deeply discouraged from ever trying. And to be honest, Chad, I have been a probability disprover my whole life. I'm a Black woman that grew up extremely low income, underprivileged by every, typical measure that would be checked off on a box of what that is defined by. But I've beat the odds every time in life, whether that be getting into college, whether that be getting good jobs, whether that be being able to support myself and thrive, whether that be encouraging and getting my parents to graduate college this year. All of the things that, have gone into my life. And so tackling climate change or trying to work on this fight to me is just another thing that maybe the odds say it's slim, but it's possible. And I really only need possible to make something happen. And I have confidence because I've overcome a lot to this point. So I think that that's maybe where some of the confidence comes from, is the fact that I don't even think it's a choice. It's like, it's either you don't do it or you do it with the belief that if you try hard enough, you can. And then where that gentleness and warmth that accompanies that comes from is the fact that my driver through all of life has always been love. That's been just my soil that I grow in. And something I'm really, really grateful for, specifically in this space, is the climate community. I see Shantae in this room, and you, Chad, and so many others. And so, even if I'm tired, even if I've been working really hard, even if I've heard a lot of no's recently in life, I get to see people, hopefully every day, that I am equally inspired by and that I deeply love and appreciate. And that is actually really what keeps me going. And so I'm so grateful for the community that exists in this space and that we continue to build. And everything we're talking about in this conversation, all the way back to the encouraging each other to bloom, is the reason that that's possible. And I think that's the reason that we'll win, because that's something that a lot of people haven't gotten hip to yet.
Yeah, I love that you say that. And I'm getting a little bit teary-eyed just hearing you say these things, because it so resonates with me and sort of my way of being is, we can't be blind to the reality of climate change, and we have to fight and tackle it. But if we approach it with love and joy and community, we can actually achieve the possibility of that regenerative future to come. And it does mean having these radically different types of partnerships that help support and nurture each other. And Shantae, our climate wife, did just join this podcast, and she's coming on in a few weeks' time as well. I mean, that kind of connection that we can share together is probably the most powerful force that's available to us to solve this great challenge of ours. And the more we link arms, the more we're likely to achieve it. And I've always thought of as the eternal optimist, and I am totally. Because that's it, because it's the love and joy that we bring to this that can make this happen. And that's ultimately what my quest is, right? My quest, the quest, Jobs Climate Quest here, is how do we solve global warming and usher in that new regenerative system? And I think love and joy and those types of partnerships and connections are regenerative, the regenerative of the spirit, the soul of the planet itself, of our economy and society. I want to ask you, and I ask this of all of my guests as a final question, what's your vision for the future? Where do you see humanity going? And what role do you want to play in making that happen?
So many things. Well, first of all, I see a future that works together for all beings, not just humans, not just animals, not just trees. Everything works together for each other. And I think that there is a lot of deconstruction, reconstruction, and reimagining that it'll take for us to get there. I think that my role in getting us there is to tackle the way that businesses operate. It's actually been something that's kind of difficult for me at different times, because people have different roles in this fight. Some people are grassroots organizers. Some people need to work on the nonprofit side. Some people need to work in policy. And I believe that my role is within the business sector, whether that be tech or investment or whatever it is, because honestly, I was given a gift, or I was trained to be able to communicate in these terms and to be able to communicate with people in the ways that they hear even if my heart is rooted in environmentalism and activism, I can operate in a boardroom. I can operate in an investment pitch. I can operate in these different spaces and I can be effective there. And so I believe that that is my spirit and where I need to be and where I need to make change. And sometimes it's at my own detriment, because of course I would love to be in the ocean and working on reef conservation and things that, are maybe my passion, but I do believe that I need to be where I am most impactful and I am able to create the most scaled change with the limited time and energy that I do have. So that's where I'll continue to operate, whether that's Planet Forward today, new solutions in the future, organizing large, industry-wide changes, movements, creating the conditions for us to rethink the way that we do business. I believe that that's where I'll continue to play. And I hope on the other side of that, we have created a system that works together for all beings and makes all beings stakeholders with valued inputs within that process.
Thank you, Kayalin, for giving us your energy, your spirit in this movement. You are truly a star. I'm glad to call you friend, glad to call you climate wife. And you are a star. I mean, I saw a photo of you at that Hollywood party on Twitter, and I thought to myself, she is the Beyonce of climate movement. You are really the queen. So I'm so honored to have you on this show and to call you and to work with you and continue to work with you and collaborate with you into the future. Thank you for joining my climate quest and sharing your vision for the future and all the work that you do.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Chad's Climate Quest. Stay tuned for our next episode when I will be talking to another planetary-grade thinker and doer, implementing real solutions to create a regenerative future. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on my climate quest.